On a miserable Tuesday morning in October of 2008, a John Deere S690 combine, all $600,000 of it, sank up to its axles in the black soil of Field 4, and Jack Caldwell watched his entire year, his reputation, and a significant portion of his net worth meet a catastrophic fate. The rain had been relentless for 2 weeks, a biblical deluge that had turned the richest farmland in the county into a bottomless primordial soup. The financial markets were in free fall, the news filled with stories of Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, and for a man like Jack, who farmed on leverage and forward contracts, getting the corn out of the ground wasn't just a job. It was an act of existential survival. This machine, this monument to modern agricultural technology, was supposed to be his unstoppable advantage, his edge against nature and the market. Let me tell you about that combine. It wasn't just a piece of farm equipment. It was a rolling data center, a testament to the hubris of the 21st century. The cab was a glass and steel cocoon of climate-controlled comfort, smelling faintly of vinyl and stale coffee. It had more screens than a stock trader's desk, displaying GPS-guided auto-steer paths, real-time yield monitoring down to the individual square foot, and moisture content sensors that adjusted the threshing rotors on the fly. Its engine was a 13.5-liter diesel behemoth that produced over 600 horsepower, a roaring beast designed to devour hundreds of acres in a single day. Its tires were taller than a man, impossibly wide, engineered with complex treads to float over the earth. It weighed over 20 tons, empty. Loaded with corn, it was a land-bound battleship. And right now, it was utterly, comprehensively, and humiliatingly defeated by mud. The very earth it was designed to conquer had turned into a trap, its immense weight becoming its own anchor, its powerful wheels spinning uselessly, churning the black soil into a slick, greasy slurry. The failure wasn't mechanical, it was philosophical. The machine was designed for efficiency in a predictable world. It was built for speed, for scale, for harvesting on sun-baked solid ground where its weight and power were assets. It had no frame of reference for this kind of elemental opposition. The operator, a young man named Kevin, who was more of a systems manager than a driver, had done everything right according to the manual. He had engaged the four-wheel drive, lowered the tire pressure, eased into the throttle. But the laws of physics are older and more stubborn than any engineer's manual. The ground pressure exerted by those massive tires was still too high. The soil, saturated to its absolute limit, lost all shear strength. It simply gave way, liquefying under the immense load, and the green giant settled into the field like a dying animal collapsing in a swamp. Jack Caldwell stood on the gravel road at the edge of the field, the cold rain dripping from the brim of his cap, and felt a pit of cold dread open in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. Every minute that combine sat there, his harvest, his profit, his entire way of life was rotting on the stalk. Let me tell you about Jack Caldwell. He was a product of his time, a man in his late 40s who had inherited a respectable 300-acre farm and through ambition, debt, and a shrewd understanding of modern agribusiness had expanded it into a 3,000-acre empire. He was respected in the county, served on the bank's advisory board, and drove a new pickup truck every 2 years. He believed with an almost religious fervor in progress. He believed in bigger, faster, and newer. His barns were filled with the latest equipment, all of it painted in the iconic green and yellow, all of it financed, all of it promising ever greater yields and efficiencies. He saw farming not as a partnership with nature, but as a battle to be won through technological superiority. He had little patience for the old ways, seeing them as inefficient, sentimental, and ultimately unprofitable. He would often drive past his neighbor's property, the Blackwood farm, and shake his head with a mixture of pity and contempt at the collection of rusting ancient machinery that sat in the overgrown fence rows. He called it Sam's Museum, a place where progress had gone to die. For 3 days, Jack waged a modern war against the mud. His first attempt was logical, a brute force solution. He brought in his largest tractor, a John Deere 963 four-wheel drive articulated monster with 8 tires and 500 horsepower. He unspooled a 2-inch thick synthetic tow rope, rated for 50 tons, and hooked it to the combine's frame. The 9630 dug in, its 8 wheels clawing at the firmer ground near the road, its engine screaming at full throttle. The rope went taut, humming with a vibration you could feel in your teeth from 100 feet away. For a moment, the combine seemed to shudder, to groan as if in protest. Then, with a sound like a rifle shot cracking across the valley, the rope snapped. It whipped back with terrifying speed, vaporizing a section of the tractor's grill guard and leaving a deep gouge in one of its massive tires. The silence that followed was heavier than the rain-soaked air. The stump didn't move. The second day, Jack tried a more engineered approach. He brought in a truckload of heavy timber mats, the kind used by logging companies to build temporary roads in swamps. His crew of 4 men spent the entire day in the cold, miserable rain, wrestling the waterlogged 300-pound mats into position, trying to build a solid base for a heavy-duty winch truck he'd hired from the city, but the ground was too soft. The mats, meant to distribute weight, simply sank under their own, vanishing into the black mire as if consumed by quicksand. The winch truck driver took one look, shook his head, and refused to even leave the gravel road. Fearing his own vehicle would become the next victim, he charged Jack $800 for the call-out and drove away. The desperation was beginning to curdle into a quiet, simmering rage. Jack was a man used to solving problems, to writing a check or making a call and having his will be done. But the mud didn't care about his bank account or his reputation. By the third day, Jack and his foreman, a grizzled man named Dale, stood in the shelter of a barn doorway, staring out at the marooned combine. It looked like the carcass of a whale beached on a black shore. They were at a dead end. They had discussed every option. A Sky Crane helicopter. The rental cost was astronomical, tens of thousands of dollars per hour, and the insurance company wouldn't even consider it. Trying to dig it out with excavators. The excavators would just get stuck themselves. Blasting. The thought was absurd, but it had been mentioned in a moment of dark humor. Dale, a man who had worked this land his whole life, finally spoke, his voice low. "Jack, I don't think there's a machine in this county that can pull that thing out. We need to wait for a hard freeze. Maybe January." January. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. By January, the corn would be worthless, a moldy ruin. The bank would call his loans. He would be ruined. It was in that moment of absolute despair that he saw it. A flicker of movement on the adjacent property line, a slow, deliberate shape moving along the old farm lane. It was an old, dilapidated farmall tractor, its red paint faded to a dull, rusty pink, chugging along with a plume of blue smoke puffing from its exhaust stack. Atop it sat a figure in a worn canvas coat and a battered felt hat. It was Samuel Blackwood. He wasn't going anywhere in particular. He just seemed to be observing, a quiet sentinel watching the slow-motion disaster unfold on the neighboring farm. He stopped his little tractor at the edge of his property, shut it off, and just stood there, leaning against a fence post, watching. He had been watching for 3 days, not with malice or satisfaction, but with a kind of patient, knowing calm that Jack found infuriating. Let me tell you about Samuel Blackwood. He was 78 years old, with hands like gnarled oak roots and eyes the color of a faded summer sky. His family had farmed this same 150 acres since the land was first cleared in the 1880s. He was the repository of generations of knowledge, a living library of how to work with the land, not against it. He was a watcher, not a talker. He watched the seasons change, watched the flight patterns of the geese, watched the way the water pooled in the low spots after a hard rain. He had watched Jack Caldwell's operation grow over the years, watched the bigger and bigger machines arrive, watched the fence rows get torn out to make the fields larger, watched the old barns get torn down to make way for massive steel grain bins. He never offered an opinion, never complained, he just watched. And he remembered his father's words, spoken to him half a century ago as they stood in the old workshop, the smell of grease and hot metal in the air. "Sam, you keep this old iron running. Don't you ever let it go. You never know when you'll need something that was built to work, not just to sell." After another hour of fruitless deliberation, Jack saw Samuel slowly, deliberately climb through the barbed wire fence and begin walking toward him. He moved with the slow, stiff gait of an old man, but there was a purpose in his stride. He stopped a respectful 10 feet away, took off his hat, and nodded. "Jack," he said, his voice a quiet rasp. "Bit of a spot you're in." Jack, his patience worn to a thread, could only grunt in response. Samuel gestured with his chin toward the stricken combine. "I might be able to help with that," he said, the words simple and direct. A beat of silence passed, then Jack, in his frustration and arrogance, let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. His foreman, Dale, shifted uncomfortably. The crew, who had been huddled in a pickup truck, looked over, sensing the confrontation. "You," Jack said, the disbelief thick in his voice. "You're going to help. With what, Sam? That little farm all? Or are you going to pull out one of those rusty relics from your barn? You think your antique toy is going to do what my $500,000, 500-horsepower tractor couldn't?" The mockery was raw, undisguised. The crew exchanged smirks. The idea was laughable. It was like offering to tow a battleship with a rowboat. Samuel didn't flinch. He just put his hat back on and looked Jack square in the eye. His calm was more unsettling than any anger would have been. "It's not about horsepower, Jack. It's about ground pressure and torque. Your machines are too heavy. They're built for pavement, for perfect conditions. They're not built for this." Then he made his offer. "I've got a machine in my barn. My granddaddy bought it new. If I can get your combine out, you don't pay me a dime. Instead, you write a check to the County Historical Agriculture Society, a generous one. If I fail, you've lost nothing but a bit more of your day. You're out of options anyway. What have you got to lose?" The logic was infuriatingly sound. Jack looked at the combine, then at the old man's steady, unblinking eyes. He was trapped. To refuse was to admit there was no hope at all. To agree was to entertain an absurdity. "Fine," Jack snapped, the word clipped and angry. "Fine, Sam, bring your museum piece over. We could all use a good laugh." Let me tell you about the machine in Samuel's barn. It was a 1932 Caterpillar 22 crawler tractor. It sat in the dark, cool air of the main barn, covered in a fine layer of dust, smelling of old oil and cold iron. It wasn't large. It was scarcely bigger than a modern garden tractor, dwarfed by the machines on Jack's farm. But it was built on a different principle. Instead of wheels, it had two long, wide tracks made of individual steel plates, or grousers. Its engine was a small, four-cylinder gasoline motor that produced a meager 25 horsepower at the drawbar. But its genius was not in its power, but in its design. Those long, wide tracks distributed its 5-ton weight over a huge surface area, giving it a ground pressure less than that of a man's foot. It was designed to float over soft ground, not conquer it. Furthermore, its engine and massive gear reduction system were designed for one thing, and one thing only: producing relentless, low-speed torque. It wasn't built to be fast. It was built to pull. It would either move the object it was chained to, or it would tear itself apart trying. There was no computer to regulate wheel slip, no sensor to cut power. It was a simple mechanical expression of will, a direct connection between the operator's hand on the clutch and the steel grousers biting into the earth. Samuel's grandfather had bought it during the depths of the Great Depression, a massive investment that had saved their farm by allowing them to work land no one else could. Samuel had learned to drive on it, his father patiently explaining the levers and pedals. He had maintained it his entire life, replacing worn parts, keeping the engine tuned, honoring the legacy of the iron. He called her Old Bess. The next morning, the rain had eased to a persistent drizzle. Jack's crew was gathered by the road, nursing coffee, their mood a mixture of cynicism and curiosity. Then they heard it. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a modern diesel turbo, but a low, rhythmic, almost gentle chugging. Chuff, 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 chuff. It was a sound from another time. Over the rise came Samuel, perched high on the seat of Old Bess. The little yellow tractor moved with a steady, rocking gait, its steel tracks leaving a neat, patterned imprint on the wet gravel. It looked impossibly small, a child's toy sent to do a giant's work. The crew fell silent. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Samuel didn't drive into the field. He stopped on the road, climbed down, and began to walk the perimeter, his eyes scanning the ground, the combine, and the surrounding landscape. He was not just looking, he was reading the problem. For the better part of an hour, Samuel worked with a quiet, unhurried precision that was mesmerizing to watch. He wasn't just going to hook up and pull, he was a physicist applying his craft. He directed Jack's crew to bring him chains, not the new alloy steel chains Jack owned, but ancient hand-forged logging chains from his own barn, with links as thick as a man's wrist. He had them attach a massive pulley block, a behemoth of steel and brass that must have weighed 200 pounds, to the base of a massive ancient oak tree that stood on the fence row, a tree Jack had often complained about as an obstruction. He then ran the chains from the combine's frame, through the pulley, and back to the drawbar of Old Bess, who was positioned not in the mud, but on the relatively solid ground of the road's shoulder. The crew, their earlier mockery replaced by a grudging respect for the old man's methodical approach, worked without complaint. They were witnessing a masterclass in mechanical advantage. By using the pulley anchored to the tree, Samuel was effectively doubling the pulling force of his little tractor. He wasn't just pulling the combine, he was pulling the combine against the oak tree, with the crawler acting as the engine for the entire system. When everything was in place, Samuel climbed back onto the tractor's steel seat. He adjusted the throttle lever, and the engine's chugging deepened into a steady, throaty roar. He looked back at the combine, then at the chains, then at the anchor tree. He took a deep breath. He eased the main clutch lever forward. The slack in the massive chains began to disappear, link by link, with a series of sharp, metallic clinks. The chains drew taut, rising from the mud, shedding water and grime. They began to hum with an almost imperceptible frequency, the sound of immense potential energy. The little caterpillar squatted down on its tracks, its grousers digging into the gravel and soil, finding purchase. The engine note deepened further, a sound of pure, unadulterated effort. For a long, agonizing 30 seconds, nothing else happened. The engine roared, the tracks were locked to the earth, the chains were stretched to their limit. The combine sat, unmoved. A few of Jack's crewmen exchanged glances, the smirks returning to their faces. This was it, the moment of failure. But Samuel knew his machine. He knew she was just taking the strain, settling in for the long haul. He nudged the throttle a fraction more, and then a groan. It was a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth, the sound of suction and friction being overcome. The giant green combine shuddered violently. Its front wheels, buried in the muck, twisted a fraction of an inch. A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Then, with a great sucking noise, the combine moved. It was not a sudden lurch, but a slow, inexorable crawl. 1 inch, then 6, then a foot. Old Bess never spun a track. Her engine never faltered. She just kept pulling, her iron heart beating a steady rhythm of work, translating the controlled explosion of gasoline into pure, relentless torque. Foot by foot, the little yellow tractor reeled in the green monster. In less than 20 minutes, the John Deere S690, oh, the pride of Jack Caldwell's fleet, was sitting on the solid ground of the field approach, its tires dripping with the black mud that had held it captive for 3 days. The job, however, was not done. The combine was free, but the field was still an impassable swamp. Harvesting was still impossible. Jack walked over to Samuel, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. I don't know what to say, Sam." Samuel just nodded and throttled down the caterpillar. "Job's not finished," he said. He drove Old Bess back to his farm and returned half an hour later. This time he was towing something else from his collection of rusty junk. It was a 1968 Alice Chalmers Gleaner F combine. It was tiny by modern standards, with a 12-foot header instead of the 40-foot Draper on Jack's Deere. It was simple, light, and mechanical. Samuel unhooked the header, drove the Gleaner into the field, and promptly got it stuck. Jack's heart sank, but this was part of the plan. Samuel hooked Old Bess to the front of the little combine. For the rest of that day, and for the next 2 weeks, the two old machines worked in tandem. The Caterpillar, with its light footprint and incredible traction, acted as a locomotive, pulling the smaller, lighter combine through the muddy field. It was slow, inefficient, and utterly beautiful. They harvested Jack's corn acre by agonizingly slow acre. The two machines, with a combined age of over 100 years, did what $600,000 of modern technology could not. Jack's crew, their cynicism long since burned away and replaced with awe, drove the grain carts, careful to stay on the few paths that were solid enough to support them. They had become acolytes in the Church of Old Iron. The day after the harvest was finally complete, Jack Caldwell drove his pickup truck down the long lane to Samuel Blackwood's farmhouse. He found the old man in his workshop, carefully cleaning the mud from old Bess's tracks with a wire brush. The air smelled of solvent and warm oil. Jack stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "Sam," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its former arrogance. "I came to apologize for what I said, for how I thought. I was a fool." He walked further into the shop, his eyes taking in the collection of old tools, the meticulously organized bins of bolts and parts. "I still don't understand," he admitted. "How? How did that little thing do it?" Samuel stopped his work and wiped his hands on an old rag. He looked at Jack, and for the first time he smiled. "There's nothing to understand, really. It's just a different philosophy. Your machines," he said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of Jack's farm, "are built for the 99% of the time when things are good. They're marvels, no doubt about it. Fast, comfortable, efficient. But they have no margin for error. The computers and the sensors, they're designed to protect the machine from itself, to shut it down before it breaks. They're built by engineers in an office who are trying to solve a problem on a spreadsheet." He patted the steel fender of the Caterpillar. "This," he said, his voice filled with a quiet reverence, "was built for the 1% of the time when everything goes wrong. It was built by men who had known hardship, who understood that nature doesn't care about your balance sheet. It has one job, to work. It will pull until the chains break, or the engine seizes, or the world moves. It doesn't know how to quit. It was designed for days just like these." He explained the simple physics of pounds per square inch, of gear ratios, of how a slow, steady pull is infinitely more powerful than a fast, jarring one. He explained that true capability wasn't about having the most power, but about having the right tool and knowing, fundamentally, how to use it. Jack listened, humbled. The lesson was so simple, yet so profound. He had spent a fortune on solutions when the answer was sitting right next door, a testament to a wisdom he had dismissed as obsolete. He pulled a checkbook from his coat pocket. "What do I owe you, Sam?" he asked, the question now a genuine request, not a dismissal. "Let me pay you for your time, for the fuel." Samuel held up a hand. "You owe me nothing, Jack. The deal was a donation." He walked over to a cluttered desk and wrote an address on a scrap of paper. "The County Historical Agriculture Society. They're trying to put a new roof on the old exhibition barn." Jack took the paper. He wrote a check not for a few $100s, not for $1,000, but for $25,000. He handed it to Samuel. The old man glanced at the number, and his eyebrows raised slightly. He folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "This will do more than the roof, Jack," he said. "Thank you." The story of the harvest of 2008 became a local legend. It was told in coffee shops and at grain elevators for years to come, a modern tall tale with a core of undeniable truth. Jack Caldwell was a changed man. He didn't sell his big green equipment, but his perspective had shifted. He became the largest benefactor of the Historical Society, and on weekends he could often be found in Samuel's workshop, learning how to weld, how to grind valves, how to bring old forgotten engines back to life. He hung a large framed photograph in his farm's main office. It showed a tiny yellow Caterpillar tractor pulling his massive state-of-the-art combine from a sea of black mud. Whenever a young, ambitious salesman would come in to pitch him the latest and greatest piece of technology, Jack would simply point to the picture. "Tell me," he'd ask, "what's its ground pressure, and what happens when the computer says no?" Years passed. Samuel Blackwood eventually passed away, leaving the farm and its mechanical legacy to his grandson, a young man named Ben, who had inherited his grandfather's quiet competence and reverence for the old ways. Jack, in turn, began to hand the reins of his operation over to his own son, Michael, a university-educated young man with a passion for data analytics and drone technology. One harsh December, 15 years after the Great Flood, a different kind of crisis struck. A freak ice storm, followed by a polar vortex, plunged temperatures to 30 below zero. A critical piece of drainage equipment at the far end of Jack's property failed, threatening to flood a newly seeded winter wheat field. The farm's new top-of-the-line service truck, a marvel of electric power and digital controls, was useless. Its advanced battery systems had failed in the extreme cold, rendering it an inert block of metal and plastic. Michael, raised on his father's stories, knew exactly who to call. The next morning, A low, rhythmic chugging echoed across the frozen landscape. Ben Blackwood arrived, perched on the seat of the very same 1932 Caterpillar 22. The little gasoline engine, unbothered by the cold that had crippled modern batteries, had started with a few turns of the hand crank. With a simple chain and a steady pull, Old Bess towed the dead electric truck and the necessary repair equipment across the frozen fields, her steel tracks biting into the icy ground. As Michael Caldwell watched the scene unfold, a near-perfect echo of the photograph in his father's office, he understood. The lesson was not about rejecting the new, but about respecting the old. It was about understanding that some principles are timeless. The engineers, with their lithium-ion batteries and their sophisticated thermal management systems, had been defeated by simple, brutal cold. But Old Bess, with her simple iron heart and a splash of gasoline, answered the call, just as she always had. That's what happens when you underestimate something that was built not for an easy season, but for a hard life.